All right, hello everyone. Welcome to webinar 6 of the Indian Energy and Minerals Forum 2022 webinar series on tribal environmental, social, and governments, commonly known as ESG. This is a forefront topic in the discussion of tribal energy and arguably one of the most important aspects in new projects on tribal lands. So this series is presented and moderated by Derek Watchman and Steve Gray of Sagebrush Hill Group. So just a little bit about our hosting program. I'm Michelle Littlefield, Program Coordinator with the USEA Consensus Program. This is a cooperative agreement with the Department of Energy, Fossil Energy, and Carbon Management. So the program seeks to educate the public, policymakers, industries, stakeholders, what have you, on CCUS and carbon management technologies by hosting webinars such as these. We also have a series of monthly educational briefings, conference workshops, technical reports, and we release bi-monthly news clips of CCUS and carbon management related updates, including rare earth elements, critical minerals, and other carbon management related, environmental justice as it relates to carbon management. To join our mailing list, feel free to send me an email to the address at the bottom of your screen. And with that, today we are joined by Acting Executive Director of USEA, Mrs. Sheila Hollis. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be here with you. It's a topic that I care very deeply about myself, and USEA does as well. And we're completely committed to fulfilling the need for a discussion, dialogue, and understanding on all the things associated with this consensus program. A little bit about USEA, just a moment of your time here. United States Energy Association, nonprofit, non-lobbying, nonpartisan entity. It's totally unique in the country. We are represented by a variety of players around our board table and in our membership. We have the national labs that are on our board. We have AGA, AGD, EEI, EPRI. They're all on our board, and it's a very National Hydropower and a variety of others. There's really a commitment on the part of USEA to improve the world, to make more energy available to the people who need it throughout the world. 30% of the world has no meaningful energy supply. We do a lot of work in Uganda as an example. There's 100 million people in Uganda, 30 million people of them have some form of energy supply other than basically what wood, little bits of wood and other biological materials they can find to utilize to cook their dinners, frankly. It's more desperate in various parts of the world than you can imagine. So USEA is working with USAID, DOE, and other players in the US government to basically improve that circumstance in the world. In addition, USEA provides a number of other opportunities, and we hope that you'll take advantage of them, press conferences, briefings, and the like, that you may find very, very useful. This is one example. This is more elaborate because of all the incredible number of years' work, players that have been involved in this, but USEA may be useful to you in a broader arena as well. We are an organization that, despite the fact we've been through COVID and all that, we are committed very much to continuing, and will continue our work throughout the world in combination with the US government and with those who are on our board, and we look forward to it. We know the incredible significance of this program. I've spent a lot of time in New Mexico, Wyoming, Colorado, the Four Corners area, and having seen up close myself the significance of this effort, I can't express enough how proud we are to be here today, what a joy it is to have these superb experts with us, and really looking forward to hearing more from you. If you have any interest in discussing anything with respect to USEA, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.
All right, with that, we can pass it on to Derek Watchman and Steve Gray of Sagebrush Hill.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Sheila. And this is Derek Watchman, President and owner of Sagebrush Hill Group LLC. I and Steve Gray, we've been tapped and commissioned to bring to these webinars discussions regarding tribal energy. And so my appreciation to USDA and also the Department of Energy through their Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. Today is our sixth webinar, and this is our sixth and final webinar for this series. And today the discussion, as we've talked about, is ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And we thought that this was very important when you talk about tribal energy development, especially on the tribal scene. A lot of tribes, many tribes, they're governments, but they're also corporations, but they're also backed by years and centuries of history, culture, and a way of life. And so when I started thinking about what does ESG mean, I think it kind of stems from the topic of environmental justice. But when you look at development, especially energy development in any country, it's just not business. It's just not dollars. It's, how do you incorporate and how do you build economies that is congruent with the way tribal folks live. And, we talk about 7 generations. What does that mean? How you talk about sustainability. So we thought today's topic would be kind of an excellent topic to close our series of tribal energy discussions. And so I'll turn it over to Steve here in a minute, but Steve is very fond of economic development, but this particular topic today is really important, I believe, to many of our tribal governments out there. A lot have been created and has been sustained because of energy. We have a lot of oil and gas tribes, a lot of coal tribes. And now, because of changes in our world, our economies, we're asking, and we're at a point where tribes have to move from their traditional source of revenue, their traditional economic mainstay, to something that's new. And so ESG, I think, is a great topic. And so I'll turn it over to Steve, and he'll talk about the economic side of it. So Steve Gray, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Derek, and welcome everyone. But before I do, I wanted to just acknowledge and ask Mr. Michael Moore to say just a few words to us before I get into my part. Mr. Moore?
All right, thank you, Steve, very much. I've had the honor and pleasure to work with Steve and Derek on a couple series of these programs, and prior to this as well, and interface with them in several areas. Big topic, a lot going on, and there's a lot of consternation in a lot of areas where the transition on the tribal side away from certain resources that provided income to them and employment and the benefits that had come with it creates a lot of issues and tensions and what have you. I'm especially interested at the end of the day, the approach to the just transition that Navajo have taken with the state of Arizona. I suspect that will probably approach New Mexico and probably California as well. And that might be something other tribes begin to follow up on as well. And I don't know if you put that in the realm of J40 and potential impacts or possibilities in the ESG world and how that looks for people to interface with the different tribal nations. But you've got a lot going on right here. And I certainly appreciate the time both of you guys have done putting together the group today and then the other 5 programs as well. A lot here. And as Derek and Steve know, give me the mic, I'll talk all day. So I'm going to shut up right now and turn it back over to them. And thank you guys both for being part of this, and plus everybody that's here today with us.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Moore. And to reiterate what Mr. Watchman said, we are very pleased to have these panel of experts to talk to us today about ESG. I think back about when we started hearing the term, and as we, meet with the different tribal officials and tribal communities, people ask, what the heck is that? What does that mean? But as we started to see it written more into documents, then people were saying that is now required Okay, now you need to have, you need to take a look at that. Then as people started digging deeper, tribal communities, individual tribals, they started to say, I think this could be a benefit to us, as we go through this transition, this could be very helpful, especially from an economic development standpoint, because as we've said from the beginning, it's as we go through this transition, as the tribes go through the transition, just like the country, the one thing they are worried about is the economic impact to their tribes, to their people. And that's very, very important. So, and what is that? What does that mean? Like everybody else, they want good paying jobs in their communities. That's what they look forward to. They want to keep their people there in their communities so that they can foster and grow in their communities, keep their language, culture, and tradition. In order to do that, though, you got to have good paying jobs. So, tribes are really sensitive to making sure that their community members have good paying jobs. They're also very aware that in order to do this, you got to have revenue to the tribe. Tribes are structured very differently in how they run the operations of their tribal governments. And so as they gain revenue from their activities they do, and a big portion of that has been fossil fuels, it has changed their way of life to run their government, to provide those social programs. But as we go through this transition, and they want to make sure that this economic development impact to them stays pretty much in a positive light to them so that they can continue to thrive. And so ESG, from what everybody says and talks about, is another tool that could help them. So what we want to do is we want to bring these experts in today to share their perspective and what they see, and talk a little bit about how they see it, how it plays a role in their activities with what they're doing. So with no further ado, we will start with our first speaker. And that individual is Taylor Reed Branson. So Taylor is with the founder Branson group. And so we're very pleased that he could join us today and speak with us. He has a passion, obviously, for this because he's a third generation farmer. He's been very involved with this group and working with ESG and sharing it with companies about their social and environmental responsibilities as we move forward in this. So with that, no further ado, we'll have our first speaker, Mr. Taylor Branson.
I very much appreciate it. Thank you for including me. It's a real honor to be on this panel, especially to have met Derek and hear about his great work with tribes around the country and down in a region of the world I've spent a whole lot of time in the Navajo Nation. So very honored, and it's a pleasure to be a part of this, especially with such an important and relevant topic right now, which I had gotten involved with years ahead of its time. And I want to share a little bit about that journey as we go on here. So can everybody see this okay? Excellent. So Branson Group came about from an interest in how to impact environmental and social change through systems of profit. And as I said, I've spent a whole lot of time in Indian country all around the nation, been invited and adopted into several tribes, heavily influenced at a young age by tribal leadership and from the cultures and traditions of such an amazing community of people. So a little bit of background on Branson Group. We're headquartered here in Washington, D.C. on Pennsylvania Avenue. So it's mostly a consultancy, but it also represents a portfolio of innovative technologies that are looking to disrupt the current global markets in sectors like energy and agriculture, medicine, and then also with these areas of fintech and finance. We're working to facilitate investment and deployment of projects within each of the areas that I just talked about, and serve as a vertically integrated ESG focused revenue model that is replicable and allows profits to be reinvested into the other companies for research, development, and further deployment. We partner and affiliate with a number of companies and nations all around the world, and committed to maximizing impact through both investment and innovation into this sector. And when I got involved 10 years ago in this work, specifically in forming this portfolio, picking technologies, it came from my previous life as assistant director for a global healthcare nonprofit. We were active in 64 countries around the world, and the need that we were witnessing in the public health sector as it related to things like access to fresh water and access to energy was so massive that I understood that we were never going to be able to fill this through philanthropy alone. We actually needed profit systems to start to orient and align with environmental and social values so that we could give the quality of life that we enjoy here in this country, in our middle class, to both the disadvantaged communities in America and then the disadvantaged communities around the globe, and indeed create a lot of profit and economic opportunity in the process. So in going down this path about a decade ago, what I originally found in identifying the companies, starting to launch them, going in front of investment potential investors, was that there was actually a legal framework that was prohibiting these investors from looking at my projects. So even though I was able to show that our disruption was going to create unparalleled profits, give entirely new economic sectors, and have this philanthropic element to them, the response was always that a 0.001% disruption, for instance, was less of a concern to somebody who had 100% of participation in these sectors the way that they were currently and are currently. And furthermore, there's actually a fiduciary responsibility on behalf of money managers to look at what is most profitable for their clients. So they can't choose an investment based on that this is going to help the globe. They actually need to make sure that their responsibility lies in the success of the portfolio for their clients. And so when ESG became more prevalent, there was a lot of excitement, especially on my part and for my projects, because we now had a new fiduciary framework and we had a new language that we could speak to that not only addressed things like profitability, but we're going to include our responsibilities to the environment, our responsibilities to our community, and then most importantly, a governance structure that is going to place the stakeholder interest alongside or higher than the shareholder interest that was prohibiting this to move forward in some of our previous frameworks that we've been working in economically here in this country and around the world. So unfortunately, there was years in this where due to vague definitions of ESG, it was able to be co-opted and used as a greenwashing tool, that there wasn't much advancement in the aspects of ESG. It was just sort of a way that companies could shed some of their responsibility and claim that they were reaching this. So the focus then was, okay, we have to form a strict ESG index and create more transparency in the space so that this can really be utilized to its fullest potential. Another aspect of this as ESG was coming about is when you're talking about innovative technologies and companies that are going to come and disrupt these industries and replace some of what we still have, there's another element there of this bridge capital that is needed. So you have already a lot of infrastructure that the U.S. government and has participated very heavily through incentivizing these industries for decades and decades. That has been put into place. And so now we're needing new infrastructure to allow these alternatives to rise to the surface and to come up. And so ESG as a indexed investment gives us a lane toward this. But we also need to look at other areas of bridge capital. As Derek had mentioned, the J40 is a format for this. That needs to be pursued very aggressively, especially in context of tribes, and then other government grants and loans and encouraging those programs and that stuff to come up is all very important. Early on in the portfolio, the other tool that I have been diligently working on for years is the inclusion of carbon credit revenue. And carbon credits give us a unique opportunity to maintain the relevancy of some of the energy industry specifically that we're still holding on to. Of course, we can't get into an airplane and, fly without emitting emissions to our destination. So certain industries are going to be intrinsically linked to the energy sources that we have today, but they can also participate in this sort of innovation and pushing forward in the support of those projects that are actively capturing carbon or doing reductions of our carbon footprint. And we have this ability to do that through this voluntary carbon market exchange, which I've worked to develop the transparency around to use this as a tool. So why we needed focus and work in this particular area was in the same way as ESG. The carbon credit exchanges have been very cloudy in their clarity of the target and purpose of what they're exactly trying to do. So there's been a need to, both clean up these exchanges and the way they're operating, while also using them as a tool to clean up the environment and be an economic engine to their fullest potential. And so we've, in this model, been able to establish that and start to build it and use it as a talking point to build trust in this as a system and to address the fact that in our we need to calculate genuine emission reductions. We need to use this as a tool for economic growth rather than just we're saving this chunk of trees and all of it is sort of in these pseudo kind of phantom credits that get generated off of it. Oftentimes looking, into the future and trying to predict what the ongoing carbon capture of projects are, and then getting those credits generated today, rather than an annual support for projects that are actively reducing credits or capturing carbon dioxide. So this is a tool, like I say, that gives us also an ability to practice and keep our companies relevant that are indeed serving a very important role in the society right now around energy. So why is this, what I put here, ideally indigenous as a model, not only economically, but of a value system that, in my impression, really aligns with Native American culture and thought and spiritualism? And there's several reasons here. This goes very deep. Of course, in Indian country, all around the nation, we have an intelligent, passionate, and hardworking labor force. Incredibly intelligent, business oriented folks that have a core community value system where they want to contribute and maintain and deliver into their community. Oftentimes the issue, as we'll look at in just a minute, is that these communities have been so deliberately disadvantaged that there becomes a vacuum of opportunity in these areas. And so we have to recognize that these are currently underutilized resources for our country in being able to participate in emerging U.S. economic sectors, so that Navajo Nation becomes the next Silicon Valley kind of thing. So we want to, use this transition as an opportunity to include and pull these communities in and give advantage to them. And then, we have high proportions of landowners that, don't have debt against their land in these communities, farmers, business owners, tourism opportunities, entrepreneurs that are already established and that actually work within a frame, this framework of an autonomous nation and community. So that we can utilize and take advantage of and grow and want to encourage in. And then this idea of a circular economy and the fact that the infrastructure in these communities is the half-life has passed so far, and that it needs really all new revamping for utilities and for housing and for development in these tribal communities. It gives an opportunity specifically for ESG index projects to come in there and have this with zero waste, and for every ton emitted in these communities, we can have projects that are capturing those tons of carbon back and having zero waste that way. So we can incentivize markets and the green sector. And then, of course, a belief system within Native communities that is around focusing on the environment and focusing on society as a whole and looking toward future generations. And as Derek mentioned, the fact that, these communities and the land stewardship, it stretches for generations. These aren't people who are going to pick up and move to Miami. They really have an investment spiritually and socially in the communities and the places where they live. And oftentimes we have to remember our tribal communities are positioned in regions of the country that at the time weren't considered very desirous. So folks were moved all the way across the nation, across the country, into areas that were at the time economically, not viable. And then as development went along and the discovery of oil and the discovery of these fossil resources, then the financial desirability of these regions increased. And we've seen a huge amount of boom economically around that. However, the economic advantage for the individual citizens and tribal members hasn't necessarily correlated with that. And there's a lot of statistics out there to show where we're at in our tribal communities with lack of education and housing and these different areas that hasn't necessarily gone with the amount of profits that have been gained from tribal lands in some of the sectors that we're discussing about the transitions happening in. So in my opinion, the way to address that is through the establishment of private enterprise. So when we're looking at ESG projects and disruptive industries and what we're going to establish as an alternative, those need to be private enterprises that are keeping the dollars made in those endeavors within the tribal lands, spent in other tribal businesses and giving jobs within the area of that. That way we have economic advantage and an ability to see real impact from these disruptive industries, more so than what we've seen maybe from the fact that they've been taken advantage of, even through kind of pseudo tribal entities that have been used to gain access into tribal lands for fossil fuel extraction projects. So a couple methods where ESG comes in and can participate in this sort of new wave and future that we're looking at is the measuring of offsets. So the direct replacement of petroleum and timber products with these renewable alternatives that are within our holding group and entity, will mean, for instance, we do bioreactors for a number of different processes for replacing petrol-based fertilizers with organic, all-natural farming fertilizer, or a bioreactor for producing huge amounts of algae that can then be made into biodiesel and to sustainable aviation fuel. So both of these kind of endeavors, utilize existing systems within tribal lands. And the most important aspect is they're franchisable. So the ownership rests within the tribal community, either at the leadership level or at the individual level. It's not the other way around, where a tiny stipend from the economic activity is going to the tribe. This is a tiny stipend is going into the licensing and the franchising of these technologies. And then the bulk of that is meant to stay and grow and create more economic opportunity in these areas. And indeed, ESG demands that be the case, because we have to remember a governance structure that is balanced with stakeholder and shareholder interests. Green energy, is of course a big, topic that's relevant to what we're discussing right now with the installation of solar and the participation in the larger grid infrastructure of the United States. And we're going to actually look at a grant very briefly that's available right now, and gives us an ability to lean into some government funds that are there to bring these ESG invested projects, back around. And then, agriculture for tribal lands to grow even renewables. We hear a lot about industrial hemp right now. That's an issue that I worked very heavily on putting into the 2018 Farm Bill, because, the growing of this industrial crop will actually replace what we're cutting trees down right now to provide. And so there's a ton of even technology resources, hydrothermal synthesis that turns it into a pseudographene carbon structure that can be used in battery technologies, et cetera. But the reality is tribal communities hold over 59 million acres of farmland. But there's oftentimes not the resources and investment to get both that land and the rest of the millions of acres of land that could be activated into agriculture going, and into some of these crops that are very high valued and have a lot of economic opportunity right now. So since our companies were originally structured around the ESG index, it makes them optimal for being deployed into this space. I mean, even though it's painful for years waiting for some of this momentum to catch up, we're now in a framework and in an area where we can participate. And it is meeting, many needs in communities, not only just the profitability and creating economics, but addressing things like utilities and the rest of the infrastructure that tribes are lacking. And then, the tribal autonomy and the governance structure of these nations within America is attractive to foreign investment. And this has been something that I've gone out around the world to really try to push, is that we're investing in tribes that have their own autonomous government structures. And really quick here, a quick example of a grant that's active right now. It's around creating green energy resources. So the funds, as you can see here, can be wind generation, solar generation, some of the biomass stuff that I just discussed, geothermal projects, This is optimal for tribal communities because it's in populations of 50,000 residents or less. It is also about the installation and construction of energy efficient improvements, meaning our housing, revamp on tribal lands. And you can see some of the grant opportunities here, up to 500,000 for these renewable projects for going in and doing solar installations and creating, business. But the most important thing is that this is fitting within economic structures that then bring perennial, ongoing economic impact to the tribes once they get installed, and that's being spread out and giving opportunities. But we want to emphasize that much more of this is needed out of the U.S. government, and especially with an emphasis on the J40 aspect. A lot of the advocacy that I've done on the Hill in the last couple of years is really we're seeing the benefits of it now. SEC has come out and really declared that we need more rigid descriptors of ESG as an investment index. So that directive has been given through the SEC. Also, we're going to see a lot more trend in this direction because the SEC has said that they will require emission reporting alongside financial reporting for companies in the United States. And at first that will be scope 1, but they're mentioning that will go as far as scope 3 emissions reports, which is all the downstream effect of environmental implications that businesses here in the US cause. And so that will demand a lot more trend in the direction of ESG and into these disruptive and alternative processes. And then a couple tribal statistics that I alluded to earlier, and why this is so important that we use it as an opportunity and fight for its inclusion within tribal lands specifically, is our post-secondary education rate at our tribes is 17%. And that's compared to 60% with the rest of the US population. So here's an opportunity to train in these new innovative sectors that ultimately will replace, and let's not kid ourselves. I mean, this is a transition that is happening that will in perpetuity be our structures for things like utilities and energy moving into the future. So in education and an expertise and a leadership on the part of tribes right now would be very advantageous and would position these communities at the front of this race in much the same way that our group has been positioned because of the last 10 years of diligence working to put all this together. And also just the sheer land size that we're talking about here. Navajo Nation, the 42nd largest state in the US, and look at, larger than 10 other states. So as a municipality and as a area for growth and economic development, we're talking about very high amounts there. And the rest of these statistics, of course, you can look up online. You've all been very generous with the time, and I know we have to get on to other speakers. So here's my email. Feel free to jot it down. Very easy, trbdc@me.com. I encourage people that are interested in this to reach out directly to me. I can consult and guide the process and make introductions into the companies that are doing the active disruption in the industries that are fading into the past at this point. So Derek, thank you for reaching out and including me, and I'll pass this on to you.
Yeah, thank you, Taylor. Very, very interesting, and I like how you scoped it, and kind of an interesting business model for tribes to consider. And you're right, and what you point out, there's a lot of funding available, and it's a matter, I think, of tribes to figure out how to partner with individuals to seek those funds. It's very competitive, but what I like these days is that in the past they used to say funds are available for state, city, and local governments. And these days, the word tribe is included. So many opportunities for many of our tribes out there, especially in this front of ESG. So thank you, Taylor. Really appreciate it. All right, let's move on. And I'm going to probably butcher the name, but let's move on to Dr. Raynia Eufrick. So my apologies. She comes to us as a professor and is the chair of the Community Plus Regional Planning Department at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, New Mexico, I take it. And so and you're also served as the regional representative of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning Governing Board. And so from what I read here, you have a rich background in social, just, and equitable institutions, environmental sustainability, and looking at how that relates to vibrant communities of many different cultures. And so thank you for joining us. Dr. Can you help me again with your last name?
Ehrenfeucht.
Ehrenfeucht. Okay, my apologies. Dr. Ehrenfeucht, I have to turn the time over to you, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, so I will share my screen. I have a few slides. And yeah, so thank you very much for that. So I'm Raynia Eufrick, and I am coming to you from Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I'm a professor in community and regional planning. And I have a very different approach to ESG because I am not focused of the world of in business and business enterprises, but much more about communities and how we think about investment in communities and what benefits them. And of course, in this conversation, we're talking about tribal nations, but also tribal communities that may not be on tribal land, and communities within tribal nations. And so communities can be different scales. So sometimes I will, be explicit about that. Other times I may say it loosely, but know that it's not just one entity. And I think you'll see that as I'm talking. And if we think about ESG as focusing on how an organization is managing risks and opportunities related to environmental, social, and governance criteria, my focus is applying this to how communities can manage and anticipate risks and opportunities through evaluating environmental, social, and governance criteria around projects, around partnerships, and really thinking of the stakeholders and rights holders as being people who are going to be impacted locally. And that's the area that I focus on, but recognize that for any project that there are people who are impacted, in many different places and areas given our interconnected world. But also that people have very diverse situations and perspectives within this, and that's part of the challenge. And so I titled this Governing Structures because when I think of these three, I am focused on how we think about strengthening our social institutions and environmental regeneration. But I think that the governing structures and how we transition them as we're thinking about an energy transition, as we're thinking about all these changes, are going to be critical to ensure that we have, improvements and kind of strengthening intergenerationally and over the next, multiple generations. And I appreciate Mr. Watchman's initial comments about thinking about this through justice, because that's the world that I come in, about really thinking social and environmental justice. And then ESG became a way that some people are trying to think about these risks and opportunities and the relationships also of businesses in this. I came into the work that I'm going to talk about today through engaging with communities in Southern Louisiana. I was living in Louisiana at the time, and the communities were facing very rapid change in many ways. This is the Gulf Coast region. New Orleans, but also another area is Terrebonne Parish, where people work in oil and gas industry, and the industry that has provided really good jobs, but also has been very volatile. And so there's been periods of growth and opportunity, and also periods where opportunities dry up and people move or have to find other work. And the industry, of course, is going to continue, but will also become a smaller share of all energy production. And so that volatility is still, something that community members are facing. These are also communities who worked in fishing and shrimping. And these were impacted by oil drilling. So one of the complexities around looking at all these changes is that there can be so many contradictory and intersecting effects of any proposal or project or partnership. But they're also impacted by global forces. And so for almost 2 decades, almost 2 decades, that farmed shrimp and fish have been sold in our markets in the United States, and that's reduced the price for shrimp and fish that are brought from the Gulf, and that makes it really hard for people to make a living. So there still is fishing and shrimping, but fewer people make a living, and so they also are turning to other jobs. And in many families, people both fish and they work in oil and gas. And there's a lot of uncertainty in this region. On top of it, there's environmental change. The coast is eroding. Hurricanes are coming closer. They're hitting harder. People are experiencing more flooding. And but the question is not only what to do, but it is how are the discussions about what to do, or how are they going to unfold? What actions are going to be implemented? What governance structures underlie these other issues? And so I am now living in New Mexico and working on these issues, how to create benefits and regenerative processes as we transition from energy production, that in New Mexico have been based mostly in coal, oil, and gas, to a more diverse energy economy. And communities in New Mexico are also facing environmental change and feeling the effects of the economic change that are relating both to the transition, but also to these environmental changes. And I will also, since I will end on really speaking on different ways of thinking about justice, that I think it's important to recognize that many communities have also historically lacked the resources and jobs. So there's inequalities in many ways. So some people are going to lose jobs in the energy transition. Other communities didn't have good jobs. And there's also many unjust practices in institutions that have harmed communities, and this becomes an opportunity that we have to really think about transitioning those communities. And so, if I say there's one overarching question, is how do we create these new systems that are going to regenerate and strengthen rather than degrade through time? How are we creating better situations for people, places, and other living creatures than perhaps we have done in the past? And I want to say one thing, because the conversations that I am in, everything is a crisis. And I think we can feel this acutely. So what you are seeing, this is an image of the Hermit's Peak fire when it was just getting started. It's been burning for 3 months, and now combined with the Calf Canyon fire in New Mexico, the largest fire complex that the state has ever seen. We are feeling the effects of climate change. We are feeling the effects of the transition, right? The, job loss, if we think of Navajo Generating Station closing, that we are also, at another time in the United States where we're reckoning with, we know that like ongoing racism and colonization in our institutions, and people really fighting to dismantle that. But I will still say that as much as these things are very urgent and critical, right? So not saying they're any less important, but when we keep saying that they're crises, or when we approach everything like a crisis, we say, what can we do now and who can do it? Instead of saying, how should this happen? Who should be making these decisions? How can we develop good partnerships? Who should be, really developing the paths forward? And this is particularly important in the work I do and the way I think about this, because it leads to situations oftentimes when people locally are feeling very complex pressures and situations and are trying to think comprehensively, that it seems like somebody coming from the outside can quickly get something done, right? Respond to a crisis. But that also may kind of shift the focus and shift priorities. And so that I really suggest that despite the urgency and the real attention we're paying, recognizing that when we think through crises, it does not lead to the kind of deliberative decision-making that we need to do, and really repairing the mistrust, among governments and their residents and citizens. Certainly among governments, we know that there have at various times in better and worse relationships between the US government and different tribal governments. And so the real need to focus on that institution building and not just, like in the energy transition, carbon neutrality. Because we could get to one goal like carbon neutrality without rebuilding effective institutions. So I am going to shift and say the way I think about it is the environmental social governance is really thinking about governance for environmental regeneration and strengthening societies. And what I want to do is just talk a little bit about how I think about this as, as decision-making structures, and with a few just really brief examples in there. Is that within this thinking, how do we rebuild the institutions and also elevate local control over everything that happens, is I outline 4 decision-making questions. Sort of who is involved in the processes and how are they involved? How will an investment or action strengthen a nation's, societies, or community ties, priorities, interests? How will an investment or action lead to environmental regeneration? And what is the long-term governing structure? And so just a few minutes on each of these. To the question who is involved in and how, I am drawing on some work that these researchers have done on thinking about research in partnership with Indigenous communities. And they, observing all the different ways it was happening, identified these levels of community participation. And the least robust are contractual or are consultative. And contractual also can be something, if we start reflecting on how oftentimes business and employment relationships are, is that community members are contracted, or can be hired to perform particular work, but may not be in control of the business itself, the decision-making, and some bigger. We know that the language of consultation and the obligatory consultation of the federal government with tribal nations has been ineffective and just inadequate. And it has oftentimes, not necessarily always, not led to the real partnerships and shared governance. And then they shift to a much more robust, and this is their graphic about an Indigenous-centered process, and thinking about that in research, but also in project development and in the partnerships that will come in the energy transition. Because there's certainly, one thing that we'll see is these enterprises and energy production on tribal nations that will be tribal enterprises, but there's also going to be partnerships, land that's near tribal nations. There will be projects where Indigenous community members will be working on these projects that will not be on tribal lands. There's a lot of different relationships. So it is really saying that even in these projects that are not within tribal lands, we have an opportunity to think about that governance structure and have different expectations of decision-making, of community and involvement. So there's this continuum of engagement, but there's also a question about the quality of that engagement. And these 6 questions speak to the quality of the engagement. Is the information about the benefits, risks, and alternatives of whatever is happening accessible? And accessible means, is it available, but is also presented in ways that everyone's going to understand. I certainly feel this acutely at times when I am talking with my colleagues who are on the technology side of the energy transition and will be very involved in some of the technology pieces that I will not fully understand what's going to happen, and will have to ask repeatedly questions. And I'm in these discussions a lot. And so I appreciate how hard it is if you're just jumping in to say what's actually going to happen here. Are the potential options, issues, and benefits reported in the context of what the community members' concerns are? Like, is it really speaking to their interests? Are they interested in jobs? Are they concerned about long-term environmental consequences, water and soil? remediation for, kind of past contamination, like what are those? And so is that the conversation that's happening? Are the community members involved recognized for their knowledge, contributions and efforts in project development? What ethical guidelines are being followed, and is it consistent with the tribal nation's ethical expectations? And did the engagement processes address the intellectual property rights and also respond to culturally relevant and sacred places, whether or not they're on tribal land? And how will the community members who are be impacted by the outcomes and outputs, and who within a community, because we know that people are really different in where they're located, like where your house is in relationship to a facility, whether you'll be working on a facility, are you going to be benefiting or not benefiting? But also, how will this investment in the community strengthen social institutions over time? And certainly, what are the community needs and priorities? And Mr. Gray spoke to this about employment really matters. Again and again, in all the work I've done, people are facing often rapid environmental change. And what they're saying is, jobs are leaving. That's really critical. People are also saying, what are the opportunities for young people? And in communities that are also very sort of grounded in place, we talked to people and they wanted their, young people to go to college, and they would love them to come back, but also know that may not be possible, and are really seeking opportunities for them. And it's also about creating those opportunities locally so people can come back, thinking about cultural sites. But I also just want to give one example here from the work we were doing in Louisiana in a community called Dulac and Terrebonne Parish. So this is a community where a third of the city or the town are Indigenous, mostly from the United Homa Nation. And we were talking to many people, and the question was investing in helping people move. So lots of people are moving because of the increased flooding in the area, and because there's so much job loss. And the state is considering assisting people in moving. And this is not tribal land, so people own their own homes individually. And lots of people already have been leaving. And what we heard from tribal leadership, and we heard from community members, is what they would like is in this investment to have tribal land. And so this is a way of thinking in the long run. Yes, we know people are moving, and that people may not all live in the same place, but there's a way that we can really continue to reinstate this and strengthen our community despite these changes, and coming up with this. So this is it's an opportunity to say, how does this investment strengthen it, knowing that these changes are occurring? How will the investment facilitate environmental regeneration as well? And one piece of this that is very complex, and I think is very important that there are conversations among people who are impacted locally, is that we know that all these actions can have multiple environmental impacts and positive and negative impacts in one given project. And certainly this was the case at the Navajo generating station, and then the mines that supported it. There were organizations that wanted, these places, even though they provided very good jobs, to close because they were contaminating soil, they're contaminating the water, impacting ranching and farming and growing. But at the same time, people need jobs, and they need good paying jobs, and jobs that will help them stay in the area. And so really recognizing that and having those conversations locally about thinking about how to address this, ensure people have good jobs, and ensure that we have cleaner water and cleaner air. And stop, getting out of a mindset that we have to sacrifice our environment for jobs, or, vice versa. And then also recognizing that when we're thinking about environmental change, we're also thinking about cultural change. And that these are, so we say environmental and social, but environmental and social are really integrated. And this is just, I put in this image because there is a resurgence of of tribal agriculture and about culturally, specific and relevant crop being grown, and that there is also these initiatives to use something like energy investment that can also contribute to these other actions like regenerative agriculture. And this is from the Department of Energy's Farmer's Guide to Going Solar. But one proposal is that we know that having kind of solar farms don't provide the kinds of jobs that generating stations provided. There's just far fewer jobs, and the jobs are in different places. They're not all local, but there can be ways that leasing the land can also have other benefits, like providing shade in our really hot Southwest climates for crops or for animals. And so really thinking what is a multi-generational regeneration that can occur in these different kinds of investments. And then this last question here is, I want to really emphasize long-term governance strategies. We have not had in the Western United States kind of a way of governing that is taking care to ensure that that there will be stewardship of land after mines close, real cleanup for oil and gas fields. I mean, we just don't have the systems in place for this. This is the Gold King mine spill in Colorado, the Animus River after the spill, and this was during a reopening of the mine that crews working breached a containment wall, and it released this mining waste into the North Fork of Cement Creek that flowed into Animus River. And that, as we know, it's not that once there's contamination, it is not straightforward how to clean our water or lands. I mean, we're facing this in many communities with uranium mining. And so when we're talking long-term governance strategies, this is multiple generations, it's hundreds of years, it's thousands of years in many of these cases. And so how do we build that into these decisions that or the projects that we are building and the institutions? And so then I am just going to end on thinking, kind of returning to social and environmental justice. This is the kind of the world that I also operate in, and a lot about public sector action. We are hearing about the Justice 40 initiative a lot. We will see what it means, but there has been, these couple decades of thinking through, or almost 3 decades of thinking through environmental justice and saying, how do we ensure that for everything that the US government does, that it can further environmental justice? And this has changed and expanded significantly. And I think that is partly where there's the opportunities now to really think about the governing aspects for social and environmental regeneration. And just to end on this point on that there is, that now social and environmental justice is multifaceted. And when we hear Department of Energy, kind of presentations that speak to this, and when we see the documents that are being created in so many different kind of for national agencies, that we started with thinking the distribution of benefits and harms. Well, who's going to benefit, who's going to be hurt by this? But now the real thing, the process by which decisions are made and projects are going to be developed, and this is really where this local decision making. But there's also a lot of power in recognizing that past harms have caused the situations that we're in, and is shaping what opportunities communities may have now, different nations have, or situated differently, given people. And this is an opportunity to recognize this in these actions, restorative action, that doesn't say that we only start from where we are now and move forward and think justice, but we actually can start repairing that past action. And the question of representative justice, about recognizing people's differences in diversity. This is absolutely recognizing that tribal nations are sovereign nations, and the partnerships among governments are just, are partnerships among governments, but people's rights to culturally appropriate action and processes. And that can mean the way you hold meetings and where they're held. It can mean how you reach out to people about things and have that expectation. And also that people's perspectives are accurately incorporated into any process that goes on. And so these are challenges. I mean, this is not straightforward. In fact, the distribution may be the easiest of these. But this is a moment to really move forward with this. And the ESG framework allows for this dovetailing of the public sector commitments to this from the US federal government and then all the work that's being done in the private sector. And so I will just end there. And so here is my email, and I certainly am always, kind of welcome any conversations about any of this on this very important work everybody is doing.
Okay. Well, thank you, Raynia. That was very, very informative. Our next speaker is Mr. Scott, Mr. Ryan Scott. He's the Vice President for Risk Management and Sustainability, and he's coming from HBW Resources. He specializes in working with clients to better understand and achieve their goal of those identifying risks that exist outside of their organization's core organization. But he also works with clients to develop an ESG reporting that will help them more than just check the box. So we're very pleased that Mr. Scott is here to join us today and talk with us from his perspective about ESG. Mr. Scott?
Hi, Steve. Thanks for the introduction. I really appreciate the comments from Mr. Branson and Dr. Aaron Voigt. And thanks to Michelle, Sheila, Michael, and others who put this meeting together. So my perspective is a little different. I don't have as many tribal ties as some of the folks on the phone. That may actually be useful. Hopefully it's useful. I'm going to speak more from my perspective in terms of the drivers for ESG. So I'm not going to necessarily follow the script here, but I do want to give an industry perspective, and I'm talking about extractive industries. So I spend a lot of time working with energy companies, oil and gas, mining, renewables, and especially in the past 10 years, there's been a big focus on environmental stewardship. I think previously you all may have heard of corporate and social governance or corporate social responsibility, something along those lines. And ESG has been the next iteration there. And I think it's trying to crystallize some of those concepts and make them a little more tangible. So I'm obligated to just speak really quickly about HBW. I think Steve gave a great introduction, but you can see the logo there, and I'll mention my email at the very end of the presentation. And then HBW has entered into a joint venture to form an entity called Esg Integrity, which has developed a tool to make ESG reporting more seamless. So happy to answer questions about either entity. Just wanted to share that really quickly. So I wanted to give a little more background on ESG and some, hopefully this is a useful level setting. But coming out of COP26, we see a big push from governments and other important stakeholders to reduce carbon emissions. And one of the strategies that's being employed is pushing ESG. So this is driven by a number of things, but I think you have investors are getting younger. They're more diverse. There are more women investing than previously, and more of those folks who are in charge of investment portfolios are looking for some sort of environmental stewardship. S&G matter as well to them. I think I would say that the E is the biggest driver in financial markets, and I think it's just in terms of, you think about ESG. Mr. Branson mentioned climate disclosures earlier. Those are things that are easier to quantify. So from my perspective, the E is the easiest to quantify and therefore the easiest to report. S and G are absolutely important. They're more difficult to quantify and therefore tend to be more binary. What I mean by that is either you have it or you don't. And there's less of a, you know, a 0 to 10 type scale for that. But in any case, we're focused on the E primarily in ESG. So I'm not going to read the slide, but you know, there was an article that I saw earlier this week that showed that you know, half of institutional investment dollars are demanding some sort of ESG discipline. The number here is 130 trillion. It's the numbers are really staggering. So there's clearly a push for this. I think that the devil is in the details, and that's what my company and I have spent a lot of time trying to solve for. So how do you show? How does a company show that they have some sort of ESG discipline in place? How does a tribal nation show that? How do financial institutions signal to their stakeholders that they're taking the demands of their shareholders seriously? So, and Mr. Branson mentioned this earlier, the SEC rulemaking that is basically taking reporting on ESG from something that's voluntary to something that's required. So, you know, some of you may be asking yourselves, well, I'm not a publicly traded company, therefore this does not apply to me. And technically you're right. However, I would note that there have been many companies that are entering into transactions, whether a merger and acquisition type deal, or even just looking to access funds from a bank. They may find themselves in the position of having to engage in some sort of ESG reporting. So we're expecting it to be required per the SEC rulemaking. But I wouldn't be surprised, even if you're not publicly traded, that someone asks you or your company requires you to have ESG credentials to proceed with the transaction or some sort of financing. So, and I think scope 3 emissions is actually a good example of that. So let me go down here for 1 second. There's another slide. Here we go. We talked about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and I want to just say a quick word about that. And apologies to anybody who's already very well versed in this. But if you take this example is from retail fuel providers. Their scope 1 emissions are related to the gasoline and fuel that they sell at their stations, right? So scope 1 is fairly simple, and they can measure it in millions of gallons sold, and depending on the type of fuel, whether it's diesel or biodiesel or something else altogether, we will be able to derive some sort of a number that shows their carbon emissions there. The scope 2 emissions is more related to ancillary but important emissions drivers. So again, if we're thinking about like a fuels retails industry, we're thinking about electricity they use on site. So maybe you think of a service station, and you've got refrigerators, and you've got lights to illuminate the pumps and things of that nature, and whatever other electricity you use. And the scope 3 of the emissions downstream, as was noted earlier. So scope 3 actually is probably the piece that'll. So again, going back to the fuel retailer, think of the car that purchases the fuel and then drives off and burns that fuel. What the scope 3 emissions is saying is that ultimately that downstream user, that driver of that car or truck, those emissions should be reported by the company that sold the gasoline. So it seems like a pretty high bar, and will be challenging to meet that. So how do you report scope 3 emissions? I think it's really going to be driven by those publicly held companies for the most part. So one really good example is, Walmart is asking its vendors to report their emissions and emission reductions. So anybody who sells anything to Walmart will be reporting their GHG emissions to Walmart, which Walmart will then in turn include as part of their ESG reporting. So I hope that's useful for folks. I hope I didn't get too far into the weeds there, but I did want to mention it since it's come up. One of the challenges, a couple of challenges for ESG reporting. I mentioned Wild West scoring groups. I mentioned a lack of standards and requirements. There's accusations of greenwashing. At the end of the day, folks from all different backgrounds are really looking for some sort of standardization and even regulatory interventions. That's where the SEC comes in. So I think some folks were not pleased that the SEC is getting involved, and I think one of the reasons that intervention from the SEC is important is there are a lot of institutional investors and folks paying, frankly, a premium for a quote unquote ESG product, and there's no real accountability to describe what that means. So what the SEC is saying is, if you are a bank, a mutual fund, and you claim to be an ESG fund, you need to prove it, and the companies that are part of those funds need to prove it. And I think it's actually a good thing. I mentioned the Wild West scoring groups. There's simply, if you're an operator, I have a story from a mining client who called and said, we're having an issue with their ESG reporting. And we heard the story, and they told us basically that, they had done ESG diligence, they had done reporting, and they had done well according to the framework that they used. The issue is there are multiple frameworks. There are probably 100 plus frameworks at this point, and there's a handful that we believe will wind up emerging as the closest to the standard, or some sort of a standard bearer. But ultimately, they got calls from investors in their board of directors who said, we got a bad grade with XYZ ESG framework. So the company called XYZ ESG framework and said, hey, we got a bad grade. Can you help explain why? And the company said, sure, we can explain why. But first you need to subscribe to our service, which is tens of thousands of dollars. And you have to imagine, maybe a company can do that once, maybe they can't, but they certainly can't do it 100 times. Not only the cost, but also the time consuming nature of reporting against all these different frameworks is really difficult. So that's why we call it the Wild West of scoring groups. And we think the SEC rule should be helpful. That also goes directly to the next bullet, the lack of true standards and requirements. We think there are a few leading frameworks, and I'm not claiming to know all of them well, but SASB is one that we've followed quite a bit. GRI is another. There's a handful, maybe a half dozen or 10 even, frameworks that we think are good. I do think it's really important that, especially at this point, if any organization does enter into some sort of ESG reporting discipline, and again, right now it's voluntary, I think there's actually a really good opportunity, one, to take credit for the things that your company does well. So if you are an oil and gas producer, or you're an extraction company of some sort, and you have really good environmental practices, and you've really been proactive, for example, on methane emissions, or you've been really proactive on sourcing your water in an environmentally responsible way. Maybe you have a recycling program if you engage in hydraulic fracturing. There are opportunities to distinguish yourself from your competitors and to show that you actually are doing these things, and you're doing them very well. And how that relates to key operating metrics is also really important. So I'll use the example of hydraulic fracturing again. I mean, water sourcing matters. It absolutely matters. If you're talking about the West, you guys know much better than I do how critical resource water is, and how interactions with agricultural communities or other uses of water can be challenging. And of course, with hydraulic fracturing, that does require a lot of water. So it's sourcing of water is very important. One, from a community relations perspective, it fits very well into the S of your business. It also means that when times are tight, when water is particularly scarce, a hydraulic fracturing company either has to produce less oil and gas or pay a higher premium for that water. So that is a great example to me of why ESG matters and how it applies directly to your bottom line. So there are other examples we could talk about, but that one hopefully will resonate with this group and make sense to you all. The accusations of greenwashing, we touched on that a little bit earlier, but I think it is, not beyond the pale for a company to maybe take credit for something that they're not doing properly, or conversely, to not get credit for something they are doing properly. So again, that speaks to the importance of having some sort of standard, some sort of quantifiable standard, especially in the E space of ESG. Okay, I think we've actually talked about all this with the SEC. There's one piece of this, the attestation piece. You know, think of this in terms of filing your taxes or filing some sort of SEC regulatory reporting. If you're a publicly traded company, you have to audit your financials and submit those to the SEC. And that, you know, you audit them yourself before you submit them, right? So that's the attestation phase. And that attestation phase is simply saying that the data that we're representing that goes into our calculation is true and correct. So, you know, my background, I came from Deloitte. I'm also an attorney. I spent a lot of time in the kind of the regulatory reporting world. We spent a lot of time with Sarbanes-Oxley implementations where, you know, the heads of companies, CEOs and CFOs would have to sign the dotted line to attest that the data was correct to the best of their knowledge. And there were you know, jail sentences threatened if companies in their leadership couldn't attest or were incorrect about that information. So it might not be quite as strict as the Sarbanes-Oxley 303 and 404 requirements, but I would expect that ultimately this will be rolled into the regular annual reporting, and, you know, an attestation will become a part of that. So actually could easily see this being rolled into the typical report. It's just would be another aspect that you would see to go along with your balance sheets and your income statements. Okay, let's see here. I think I've talked about most of this already. These are the drivers for ESG. You know, access to capital is really important for most companies and organizations. I do think that, you know, if everything else is equal, if your organization has an ESG discipline in place that you can point to, I think it makes it more likely for you to get more access to capital or access to capital at a more favorable rate. Think of it like insurance to get access to capital. I think if you have it's like having a better driving record, you tend to get a better rate there. I mentioned earlier Walmart. I think in banks and M&A, you know, you could easily see yourself where you're getting some sort of pressure or expectations from your supply chain partners or clients. And of course, there are a lot of benefits to implementing an ESG program. So climate change, Dr. Eufrick did a good job of addressing that, as did Mr. Branson. I think there's also an aspect of competitiveness. If we're looking at, you know, workforce is always a scarce commodity, especially qualified workforce. And I think the young people entering the market especially really care about things like ESG or the things that ESG stands for. So if you can go back to them and say, look, here are the things that we do, and you can substantiate those things you do to be more environmentally friendly, to be more socially conscious, to show that you have a governance structure in place, I think that'll help you attract and retain top employees. I touched on the operating expenses briefly. I think if you're doing ESG well, it should reduce your operating costs. And of course, there's the public relations bump that's beneficial as well. So, and I'll just talk really quickly about or Derek, am I out of time here? Or getting there?
No, you're good. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'll try to zoom through this, but I mentioned the ESG Integrity Application. We've worked with industry. We worked with the EPA and Argonne National Laboratories to come up with basically a turnkey program that'll make it very cost effective and relatively easy to engage in ESG reporting. So we're excited about it. The results have been good, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody about it who has any questions here. Let me see here. That's just a quick snapshot of the application interface. And again, same for the social aspect of it. And finally, governance. So I did want to mention this, and it ties into the talk. So happy to answer questions offline about the application. But one thing that speaks to the need for a framework here, and I think whoever engages in an ESG reporting will have to do something like this. We basically mapped out what we thought were the leading ESG framework. So here's GRI and SASB. And for every data point that we collect in our reports for our application, we link it back to an applicable framework placeholder. So instead of doing 5 separate reports, we'll simply allow folks to say, hey, we did item 1A, and that references, the following EM-MD-110A.1 for GRI and XYZ for SASB. So the idea is you do a single report, and for folks who have a particular framework they like the best, you can send them on their merry way to compare against the framework that they like. So that's just my information. If you guys have questions, Derek, Steve, and team, I really appreciate the opportunity today. Happy to take any questions or do whatever you guys like.
No, thank you, Ryan, and we appreciate it. I have a quick question because I was actually talking to some of my auditor friends, and the questions that's coming up is, when you do your audits, you have to prepare in either GASB or FASB, and I think what we're talking about is more or less a Security Exchange Commission. If you're a public company, do you think you'll get to all independent financial audits where you have to have a ESG statement, especially, for the FASB and GASB folks? That topic came up, and I thought that was an interesting question. And it relates to tribes and tribal enterprises. They all have to do independent financial audits, and we can get to that point.
Yeah, I mean, my view, Derek, is I think it'll become part of your regular annual and quarterly reporting, and they'll simply say, here's the ESG aspect of your financial reports, and you'll bring in EY, Deloitte, or whoever you use, and they'll simply report on those aspects as well. That's my view, but curious to hear what others think.
Yeah, well, I know there's some auditors that audit tribal financial audits, and they're not there yet, but they're actually looking into it to see, whether or not they have to have ESG reporting. So, but thanks. I don't see any questions here, but maybe between Steve and I, we can kind of close this out here. But great presentation, and I've learned a lot about ESG, and in some cases it's still growing. I remember years ago getting involved in environmental justice, and it was kind of esoteric, and it was kind of concept and what does it mean, and how do you apply it to the work situation. But it seems like environmental justice is now growing into this new concept of ESG. When I talk to a lot of tribal folks, they say, "Oh, wait a minute, we've been doing environmental. We've been sensitive about the environment. It's unfortunate we've had to take on certain in order to, as Steve mentioned, in order to have jobs, we've had to get into the unattractive industries, but that has kept us afoot. And so now we're in this new era. And so, very good information. I appreciate everybody's insight on ESG. And maybe Steve, you have some thoughts there, and we can close out.
So, Derek, there were two quick questions, and I know we got a couple of minutes left. One is so if you could just, the panelists real quick could take a minute and just answer. One question was, is ESG the new norm from here on out? And the second question was, should tribes implement their own guidelines for ESG themselves?
Steve, could I respond to that? Sheila here.
Sure.
I think it's pretty clear that ESG is the name of the game, and you're just seeing the tip of the iceberg of what's coming. ABA adopted it into its basic tenets, and there's not a whole lot of positions that the ABA takes to this nature, with American Bar Association, but other institutions are as well. And it basically is, it's almost to the point where the law firms will not represent entities that do not take that into account. I mean, it's really going down a long way down the chain. And that's why I think even if you are only mildly interested, you might be more interested if you realize some of the under-discussed consequences where it may be very, very difficult to deal with if you have not taken those steps.
Okay. Thank you.
One thing that I've seen, pardon the interruption, one thing that I've seen kind of from a business aspect is that they're tending to go from the one bottom line, the one profit bottom line, to what they call a triple bottom line, the 3 Ps: people, planet, and profit. And that's becoming much more of a norm here on out than just the one bottom line that is profit.
Okay.
Yeah, I would echo all that, and then add, absolutely a governance structure on a tribal level around ESG would be very valuable. Especially in my presentation, I really focused on how to guard against the same activities that have happened on tribal lands, and that this is our opportunity to not repeat that. Within the holding entity that I run, I emphasized our structure around the core practice of giving business ownership, job opportunities, and keeping those dollars within tribal entities. The other important thing here that we have to look at is the regionalization aspect of emissions. So I think gone are the days when, transport of products and food is going to crisscross our globe, because all of that will have to be reported. Every time it leaves one location and travels, thousands of miles to get to its next destination, will have a carbon footprint that ultimately will need to be eliminated, which gives us an opportunity to build more regional structures around things like fuel production and things like agriculture. And tribal communities are uniquely able to seize that opportunity because they're spread out all across the US. And it's been one aspect of this that I've emphasized and tried to encourage in the consulting in that area. And then in terms of ESG being a wave of the future, a consultant that I use a lot, he spent his whole career as a professor of law ethics, and contributed to the framework that we now have as ESG. So this has been a long time coming. It's multi-decades of commitment and lifetimes of dedication on behalf of people to deliver to us the rubric that we now have to take forward and polish and turn into something that's beneficial for all of our communities and planet.
Hey, Steve, quick thought, and I'm going to make it fast. So I sit out here as an individual. There's a lot of things I can do, own companies, what have you, engage all the commercial opportunities and services. And that's really all I got to do. But if I'm tribal, everything I do, I got to go through BIA. Where are they on all this and the reporting methodologies and requirements, and what do they recognize, especially if there's going to be land or services or ag or any of these other kind of things that entail stuff on top of tribal land? Where does the BIA sit in the middle of all this stuff?
Our experts want to answer that. How does that's really the government he's asking, the federal government from Interior.
I don't know the answer to that question, and I would imagine they would take their cues from other branches of the government who are more engaged in it. For example, the SEC we've mentioned a few times. I did want to mention one quick thing. We talked about, Mr. Branson said you should probably promulgate some sort of standards, especially for folks who are going to interact with the various tribes. I agree. I would also recommend, handicapping the frameworks that you think are most fitting, right? So you can very much tailor what statistics you want to promulgate and track and require. But I think it makes a lot of sense to say, look, we think SASB is going to be used. We think GRI is going to be used. Let's make sure that our stats can be translated to those places. So when it comes time to report and to require folks to do it, they know what the heck we're talking about.
And the one thing that I would also just emphasize with that is, of course, tribal nations are different and have a lot of different priorities. And I think the guidelines, part of that is to make sure that those priorities lead in partnerships and everything else. And so that it's making that explicit and having the time to think through that. And I don't know the answer about the BIA, but given that, the tribal governments are sovereign, that I don't think that will end up being what's defining on the impact of ESG on these relationships.
Okay. Well, again, I want to, on behalf of our group here, I want to thank all the panelists for joining us today, for sharing your expertise. We're sure this is a topic that's going to go on for a long time, and people will always have questions about it, so having people that are working on it, and sharing their thoughts and views about it really will help, in this case, the tribal communities as they listen in on it too as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Derek to give closing remarks. And again, thank you everyone for joining us. Derek?
Thank you, Steve. And yes, I want to thank obviously the Department of Energy and the United States Energy Association and the team, and then our three speakers here. ESGA is not a new topic. Like I said, it's something that we'll have to figure out how to transition to. And so, bottom line for Indian country, as Steve pointed out, tribal development is still ongoing. There's many things that need to happen, especially on the energy focus. And so between Steve and I, we've been happy and delighted to be able to present these 6 webinars. And our thought is that it generates discussion so that we have the networks that are out there. Tribes can reach out to their partners, to their federal agencies, so they can figure out how to move the pendulum when it comes to energy development, because that's energy in many cases is one of the primary ingredients to have good development. And so we've been pleased that we're able to do this. We're hoping to move forward with some other topics in this fall along the lines of tribal energy development. And what we're really looking for is just how do we have long-term, viable, sustainable tribal economies, tribal lands. And so I've been doing a lot of reading on economic development, and there's a crisis out there. When you look at reservations and where our folks live, many of our tribal folks are leaving our reservations. I heard that yesterday. And if you look at the census, over the last, for example, last 10 years, we've had probably a 20% decline on many of our reservations. And so what does that mean? Reservations with no people there, does that erode sovereignty? Does that erode, the tribal nations? And so those are some of the things that Indian country is talking about. And so our tribal energy program, we hope, will provide information so that tribes can equip themselves to grow and bring people home. Many of us, I'm Navajo, Steve and I are Navajo, land is fundamental. Land is a part of us. We have to live in it. So without it, that could make us, it could challenge our future. So with that, today's, I think, is a good opener into what tribes need to think about and folks that deal with tribes. So with that, I want to say thank you. We look forward to it. And by the way, this series will be posted on the USA website. So if you want to go back and look at it, it is available. So thank you, Sheila and Mike and Alex and Michelle for your time. And thank you, Steve. It's a great program. So with that, I'll say thank you and so long. And we'll be coming up with some more information soon. Take care and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Take care.